For nearly a decade, any genuine inquiry regarding Ilhan Omar's marital history was regarded as a moral transgression well before it was considered a legitimate query. Each reporter who approached this topic was relegated to the same distasteful corner of public ignominy. Every researcher who requested pertinent records was denounced for pursuing insubstantial leads. Any citizen who observed inconsistencies was informed that the actual scandal lay not within the discrepancy, but within their observation of it. The accusation was never refuted with the assured composure of an individual possessing unblemished documentation, nor resolved with a single certified record clearly displayed, nor overwhelmed by substantial proof, primarily because no such evidence was ever presented to do so. In lieu of explanations, the nation received admonitions, counter-accusations, rhetoric focused on identity, and the recurring, refined assertion that the investigation itself constituted prejudice, as if the term Islamophobia could be applied like an official legal seal over each unresolved document until the underlying paperwork ceased to carry importance. For 8 extensive years, this approach succeeded primarily because the majority of individuals in Washington are intensely afraid of receiving the label she applied to them, sufficiently fearful to cease questioning, and sufficiently afraid to feign that silence equates to decency when, at times, silence is merely cowardice presented acceptably for television. Then, Senator John Kennedy positioned a 1995 federal immigration document before her, a form featuring 2 names contained within the same family unit, on the same explicit line of definition within a single government record. Instantly, the specific term employed to close all avenues of inquiry was forced to confront a document entirely indifferent to the label anyone might give it. He enunciated both names clearly and deliberately, allowing the attendees sufficient time to grasp that this was not a rumor being resurrected for cable television news, nor a social media theory imported from extreme corners, nor a partisan slight cloaked in committee terminology, but rather an official paper trail that had evidently been situated in a federal storage facility while a collective political class feigned that no such trail could possibly exist. She has remained silent publicly in the period following. This prolonged silence is significant because the issue was never confined solely to a single statement, one marriage, one caption, or a solitary tax filing. It was fundamentally about the method by which a public official can construct a barrier using accusation, ensuring that anyone approaching this barrier is made to feel ashamed before even making initial contact. It concerned whether a politician can devote years to informing the country that a specific question is malicious, all while consistently avoiding the production of the very document that would render that question irrelevant. Furthermore, it was about the outcome when an individual ultimately ceases to apologize for questioning and instead simply places the relevant record upon the table. Ilhan Omar remained seated with an erect back, her chin positioned level, and her hands placed at equidistant intervals from the microphone. This posture reflected the specific geometry of someone possessing a precise understanding of how power is visualized when conveyed through a camera lens. No aspect of her posture appeared unintentional, rather, it was structured, deliberate, and fully prepared for the camera. This particular type of symmetry is perceived as composure by viewers unfamiliar with how frequently such calm is practiced prior to an impending storm. Her hijab was situated with absolute precision, with every fold carefully managed and each visible detail arranged to strengthen the image she intended to have projected from that room before any questioning could potentially damage it.
Her facial expression conveyed the rehearsed composure typical of a politician who has navigated controversy not through providing comprehensive answers to challenging questions, but rather by rendering the very act of posing those questions as something repulsive. Moreover, when she initiated her remarks, her voice exhibited no tremor, nor did it falter or display any uncertainty, as this constituted the opening statement she had meticulously refined over many years. "This proceeding does not concern itself with oversight," she stated, and the assertion resonated precisely where she intended, impacting not the committee or Kennedy, but the wider audience observing from beyond the immediate room. It revolves around a Muslim woman, a black woman, and a refugee who arrived in this nation with nothing and constructed a life that frightens the individuals seated opposite her. She pointedly avoided looking at Kennedy during this statement because Kennedy was not the individual she sought to convince. Rather, he was simply the impediment situated between her and the camera. Her gaze directed itself to the camera lens positioned on the left side of the dais, specifically the one distributing the broadcast feed, which would promptly transform her remarks into sound bites, headlines, supportive posts, and ethical pressure long before anyone possessed the opportunity to scrutinize what was being deliberately circumvented. Whenever they are unable to overcome my arguments, they resort to assaulting my identity, my marital history, my family, and my religion. It is the identical strategy Senator used for 8 years, the same exact playbook, she persisted, and there was evident skill in her delivery, as the cadence of accusation was refined to a degree that appeared almost subconscious. Furthermore, I am present today because I have never harbored fear regarding their inquiries. This constituted the essential assertion she required, the declaration that transformed the hearing room into a theatrical stage and reframed every unresolved document as a demonstration of her fortitude rather than evidence of her evasion. She had just informed a Senate hearing that she had provided answers to every query for 8 years, and she delivered this statement with the direct conviction of someone gambling that no individual in the chamber would be willing to verify her assertion against physical documentation. Senator Kennedy possessed a file folder positioned before him, and contained within that file was the single document she had spent those identical 8 years adamant about non-existence. John Kennedy remained seated with his hands clasped, his eyeglasses positioned near the tip of his nose, and his file folder still shut, deliberately refraining from interrupting her because doing so would have worked to her advantage. He did not visibly react, manifest outrage, or attempt the dramatic rhetorical counterattack that individuals of lesser stature employ when seeking to derive authority merely from their loudness. He merely waited with the enduring patience characteristic of a fence post enduring a Louisiana breeze, remaining erect, unassuming, and still present long after all the auditory commotion has dissipated. Throughout her statement, no significant movement occurred within him, involving neither his shoulders, his mouth, nor his hands, because he grasped the principle that an individual should be permitted to complete the construction of their barrier before one demonstrates to everyone the precise locations where the structural foundation is fractured. Upon the conclusion of her remarks, he allowed the chamber to sit with her words for a duration of 5 seconds, and within those 5 seconds, the camera could only capture the lingering confidence she had just officially entered into the record. "Congresswoman," he began, and his tone was so muted that the microphone appeared to exert extra effort merely to project his voice into the room, "you have asserted that you have answered every question for almost years, and I accept that statement at face value." The inherent gentleness of the statement did not signify kindness, rather it constituted a snare constructed from courtesy, the variety that appears benign until all avenues are sealed. Therefore, I am simply going to pose a few of them again very quickly, and you may provide me with the identical responses you have consistently offered, and then we will all depart for dinner. He proceeded to open the file folder unhurriedly, and this minor action possessed greater impact than a raised voice, because every individual present in the chamber grasped that the period for speeches was concluded and the documentary phase had commenced. The atmosphere changed, not in a dramatic cinematic fashion, but rather like a courtroom setting when the attorney finally ceases pacing and begins reading directly from an entered exhibit. "In 2009, you entered into a legal marriage with an individual named Ahmed Noor Sid Elma. Is that correct?" Kennedy inquired. "Yes," Omar responded, and the reply was delivered with sufficient speed to imply it had been prepared entirely before the question was even posed. "Moreover, in 2002, 7 years prior to that event, you participated in a religious marriage ceremony with a man named Ahmed Hersi," he continued. "Yes," she reiterated, remaining composed, self-controlled, and firmly within familiar conversational bounds. "You were involved in that religious marriage to Hersi at the time you contracted the legal marriage to Elm." Her chin elevated slightly, not to a degree noticeable by a casual observer, but sufficiently for the immediate audience to detect the initial onset of resistance. "We had separated, Senator. Marriages terminate, individuals proceed with their lives, and this is not convoluted." The statement was delivered rapidly, concise, and practiced, typical of an answer that seeks not simply to address a query but to decisively close off the topic before further questions can be introduced. It was not necessarily nervousness that dictated the speed. Rather, it was the specific velocity associated with preparation. the cadence of a prepared response retrieved from storage for precisely this type of situation. Kennedy did not pursue the matter, as individuals typically engage in pursuit when they lack the necessary subsequent evidence. "The situation presents certain complications, ma'am," he remarked. "Inasmuch as during 2014 and 2015, while remaining legally married to Elm, you proceeded to file joint federal tax returns with Hersey, the individual to whom you are not legally wed." Omar positioned herself closer to the microphone, and this physical shift carried greater significance than her subsequent words, since physiological reactions frequently betray true feelings before verbal communication can be negotiated. The movement possessed the characteristic of an individual grasping for a handrail on a staircase that abruptly felt unbalanced, urgent yet avoiding outward panic, manifesting control only because maintaining control remained absolutely essential. "I initiated the correction of those filings of my own accord," she stated. "The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board examined the issue, and I fully cooperated throughout the process." The term voluntarily was articulated a moment too quickly, appearing overly refined and excessively eager to convey the desired meaning before the rest of the statement could be properly evaluated. Kennedy allowed the statement to remain uninterrupted, as certain words tend to reveal their own weaknesses when not immediately challenged. "Following their discovery of the error," he remarked, "after they subsequently brought it to my attention," she confirmed, reasserting, "Yes, and I cooperated fully." The reiteration of that phrase, "cooperated fully," failing to bolster her response but instead diminishing its credibility. The repetition functions similarly to a person double-checking an already secured lock, revealing less about the state of the lock and far more regarding the underlying anxiety of the individual performing the action. Her fingers shifted toward the table's perimeter, not grasping or trembling, but merely locating the surface's firm boundary, as though her body required reassurance that at least one element in the room remained stable. "Matters involving immigration and religious marriages generate unique complications that the American taxation system was not structured to manage," she asserted, shifting focus away from specifics and back into the ambiguous moral space where she typically operated with greater ease. "I would assume an individual who asserts support for immigrant communities would comprehend that." The statement directed at Kennedy, resembling an accusatory finger pointed at the incorrect person in a lineup, incisive, assertive, ethically charged, and yet entirely irrelevant to the issue at hand. He refrained from responding to the provocation, as it was exceedingly obvious, and also because his purpose there was not to debate tone, identity, culture, or the emotional difficulty associated with questioning. He executed a single nod, mirroring the gesture an individual makes when presented with a restaurant bill that aligns precisely with expectations. "That is a reasonable point, Congresswoman. Taxation law is indeed complex, and I will concede that fact." He then turned the page in a deliberate and unhurried manner, as the lack of speed itself constituted a form of psychological pressure. "Turning now to Ahmed Noor Say El-May, the individual you legally wed in 2009, what exactly is his relationship to you?" For the first time, the inquiry did not merely seek clarification on a timeline. It demanded that she directly confront the single allegation that had been meticulously shielded for years by displays of outrage, denunciation, and calculated ethical revulsion. "He is my former husband. We finalized our divorce in 2017. "Is he in fact your brother?" Kennedy inquired. The alteration in her facial expression was minimal, yet such slight changes are frequently the most truthful, involving the subtle clenching of muscles along the jawline and the fractional elevation of the mandible, the type of physiological movement an official transcript fails to document and a camera recording never obscures. Her facial expression did not dissolve, but rather became rigid, and this rigidity preceded her response by a moment, signifying that her physiological reaction had processed the inquiry before she formulated her verbal response. "That assertion is a vile fabrication," she stated, her vocal pitch increasing perceptibly, mimicking the way a tensioned cable tightens when stress is applied. "It has been perpetuated by prejudiced blogs and individuals promoting Islamophobic conspiracy theories who have focused their attention on me since my initial day in office. I have addressed this matter in public forums, I have provided testimony regarding it under oath, and I refuse to sit here and validate. Ma'am, I did not inquire regarding blogs, Kennedy retorted, his vocal tone remaining entirely consistent, refraining from escalating to match hers as it was unnecessary to engage in a verbal competition. I presented a query requiring a binary yes or no response, this statement serving as the initial clear demarcation of the proceeding, unobtrusive and undramatic, yet precise, differentiating the specific accusation from the response she had failed to provide. Furthermore, I have responded to that repeatedly over an 8-year period. The answer is negative. You have addressed it by labeling the inquiry itself as a hate crime, Kennedy counter-argued, and that is fundamentally distinct from addressing it through the provision of documentation. Omar's hand lifted from the table surface and positioned itself upward, palm open, a gesture characteristic of an individual pleading before a jury in a situation where the supporting evidence is lacking. The gesture appeared practiced, yet even refined physical movements can manifest desperation when the underlying question remains entirely unaddressed. I am under no obligation, Senator, absolutely no obligation, to disclose my family's private documentation merely to appease the inquisitiveness of individuals who have dedicated themselves to causing my downfall, she asserted, adding, no member of this legislative body has ever faced such a request. Nor has any member of this legislative body ever been accused of marrying their own sibling congresswoman. 6 distinct words inserted themselves into the midst of her statement like a key precisely fitting a lock, lacking force, displaying no visible heat, and appearing effortless. Her open palm subsequently closed, the fingers retracting inward sequentially, and her hand was repositioned onto the table with a muted finality akin to a door being sealed from within. Throughout the remainder of that specific dialogue, the hand did not lift again. An observer seated in the gallery, who had consistently nodded in agreement during Omar's initial statement, doing so with the subdued assurance of an individual believing she already understood the definitive moral alignment of the proceeding, abruptly ceased moving her head. She froze, her head held at a fractional angle, not in a dramatic or performative manner, but with the specific muted stillness typical of someone reevaluating a fact she had previously permitted herself to regard as established. This constituted the initial perceptible fissure appearing beyond the immediate witness table, and it was significant because public defenses comparable to Omar's do not persist solely through evidence. Rather, they endure on the basis of an audience prepared to continue nodding in agreement before any actual proof is presented. Kennedy observed the reaction without visibly appearing to have done so, as individuals with significant courtroom experience recognize that the overall atmosphere of the room frequently changes before the witness themselves does. Subsequently, he redirected his focus back to the documentation, as the physical evidence had been where the essential argument was consistently waiting to be addressed. The Star Tribune, Kennedy proceeded, his voice maintaining its low pitch, consistent level, and characteristic dry patience that causes individuals with louder volumes to appear histrionic in comparison. Your own local hometown newspaper, not a conservative blog nor a talk radio program, conducted an investigation regarding this very question. He deliberately avoided rushing when stating the publication's name, as the central point was not simply that journalists had posed inquiries, rather the significance lay in the fact that the very institution closest to her own political base had attempted to resolve the question, but was unable to do so definitively. Within their own physical pages, they published statements declaring that they were unable to either conclusively substantiate or disprove the allegation. At that moment, he raised his eyes, not for dramatic effect, but rather to ensure she fully grasped that this was not an unsubstantiated internet rumor being brandished like an insignificant theatrical prop. Your own publication attempted to exonerate you, ma'am. They failed to do so because you refused to provide them with the necessary documents. The Star Tribune is free to report any information it wishes, Omar asserted, her voice regaining a degree of stability, though distinct from the tone she had employed in her opening. Her initial vocalization had been fluent and expansive, designed specifically for cameras and positive public reception. Conversely, this iteration was narrower and more constrained, conveying the evident strain of a defense compelled to shift focus from identity back to actual records. Journalists who engage in promoting Islamophobic conspiracy theories do not acquire credibility merely by virtue of their employment with a mainstream newspaper. This represented the habitual maneuver, the dependable tactic, the specific strategy that had sustained her through years of inquiries by preemptively discrediting the individual posing the question before the question itself could be properly assessed. However, on this occasion, the maneuver failed to proceed as extensively, as Kennedy had already situated the specific newspaper between her and the accusation, and a mainstream publication was not readily susceptible to being smeared without incurring significant consequences. Therefore, the Star Tribune is characterized as Islamophobic? Kennedy inquired. He posed the query mildly, bordering on nonchalance, and this intensified the situation because the question failed to resemble an assault, sounding instead like simple logic. "I did not make that assertion," Omar responded, and her chin lowered fractionally before abruptly snapping back upward, a microscopic physical adjustment so minimal it would disappear within a written transcript, yet not on a video recording. Her physique had registered a flinch precisely where her mouth declined to retract, and that is frequently the manner in which contradiction establishes itself within a room, not in the form of an explicit confession, but rather as an unintended muscular movement. Kennedy once again clasped his hands, deliberately offering her no escape route through displaying outrage. "You stated that journalists who pose this specific question are engaging in promoting Islamophobia." He remarked that the Star Tribune has indeed asked this question. He allowed those two distinct premises to remain side by side, sufficiently obvious for a child to grasp, and sufficiently hazardous for a politician to navigate. "I am simply an unsophisticated country attorney, ma'am. Yet in my courtroom, if an individual labels a specific query Islamophobic, and a reporter subsequently poses that query, then the reporter is deemed Islamophobic. That is how simple logic functions, or at least how it used to." The statement did not require explicit force, primarily because the impact was inherent within the structure of what she herself had articulated. "You are distorting my remarks, Senator," Omar asserted, and the accusation was delivered too precipitously, comparable to the manner an individual attempts a punch after already losing their balance. "I am merely reciting them back to you, ma'am," Kennedy responded. "There is a distinction." He reached inside the file folder and extracted an additional page, and the physical paper itself appeared to alter the atmosphere at the witness table, since every subsequent sheet diminished the available space for rhetorical abstraction. Omar had been trying to keep the hearing inside the language of motive identity and harm. Kennedy kept dragging it back to noun states, names, filings, captions, and receipts. Turning to June of 2012, Kennedy stated, "Following the birth of your third child, a photograph was posted by an Instagram account identified as belonging to Ahmed Elma. No movement occurred within the room, yet overall attention intensified because everyone present could perceive that his inquiry no longer concerned itself solely with a single legal document. An individual is depicted holding a newborn infant, your infant, Congresswoman." He proceeded to read from the printout with the flat specificity typical of a man cognizant that injecting emotion would only diminish the effectiveness of the entered exhibit. The caption explicitly omitted references like "my daughter" or "my stepdaughter," failed to employ the child's actual name, and instead the caption stated "nieces." He positioned the printout upon the table surface, and the specific word remained there with an intrinsic repulsiveness that no amount of committee-facilitated refinement could possibly mitigate. Nieces, that was the specific term the individual she had legally wed had supposedly employed to refer to her newborn daughter, not within some obscure dialect hidden deep within family closeness, nor in a confidential private journal, but rather in English on a public social media platform within a caption connected to a photograph. "Social media captions do not constitute legal documentation, Senator," Omar stated, and for the initial time her hand refrained from moving toward either the water glass or the table edge, shifting instead to her own wrist, with fingers pressing gently into the interior of her forearm, the specific self-soothing gesture of an individual whose physique has begun managing itself without conscious authorization. "Individuals in various cultures utilize terms of affection that lack direct translation into English," she remarked, to which Kennedy retorted, "Congresswoman, nieces does not represent a term of affection in any culture of which I possess knowledge." It signifies a specific family connection, defining the child belonging to one sibling. The statement was neither poetic nor dramatic, and it was precisely that absence that gave it such piercing impact. Omar's gaze intensified, and at that point, her defense shifted to its customary course whenever documentary evidence proved too difficult to manipulate. "You lack expertise regarding Somali culture, Senator." The statement was delivered with evident force, yet force is distinct from foundational support, and everyone present in the chamber could detect the inherent emptiness underlying her remark. She had grasped at the concept of culture in the manner a drowning individual clutches at floating wood, not because wood constitutes a vessel, but simply because it represents the final object remaining buoyant. "No, ma'am, I am not an expert," Kennedy conceded, executing a single nod and accepting the objection as though he had actually welcomed it. "Nevertheless, the term nieces is English. Your spouse inscribed it in English upon an American social media platform using the English language, and within English it possesses a solitary definition, and that definition signifies the daughter of a brother or sister." He subsequently changed direction, and this transition itself presented danger because Omar had evidently prepared extensively for inquiries regarding the brother allegation, the taxation issue, the term Islamophobia, and the public presentation of injured dignity. However, the contents of the file folder were not yet exhausted. "Let us now discuss your current spouse," Kennedy suggested, extracting a new segment from the documents and aligning it directly before him with the subdued precision typical of someone readjusting a blade. "Tim Minette." Omar's physical posture altered, neither collapsing nor capitulating, but rather restructuring in the manner a boxer reapportions weight upon realizing the contest is extending longer than anticipated. Her shoulders retracted significantly, and her chin was repositioned to a level stance through effort rather than relaxation. "Regarding him, what is the issue?" she inquired. "Your campaign engaged his consulting firm, the E Street Group, back in 2018, Kennedy stated. "Between 2018 and 2020, your campaign disbursed over $3 million in consulting fees to his firm. The specific figure arrived with greater impact than any descriptive word could possess, as adjectives allow for debate, whereas numbers merely exist and require an explanation." "Tim's firm delivers legitimate professional consulting services," Omar asserted, and the term legitimate was conveyed with heavy emphasis, the particular type of stress individuals employ when they already perceive suspicion coalescing around the concept. "He stands as one of the most experienced political strategists in Washington, and the selection process was both competitive and transparent." "Throughout that identical time frame, Congresswoman," Kennedy remarked, "during the specific months those checks were being issued, you initiated a personal relationship with Mr. Minette." He refrained from rendering the statement salacious, did not grin, nor did he exaggerate the potential scandal, as the underlying situation required no further embellishment. Omar's hand reached for the microphone and adjusted its position, despite the fact that the microphone had not moved, and this superfluous adjustment communicated to the chamber the very anxiety her face was still attempting to conceal. "My personal matters are not the topic under consideration in this hearing, Senator," she asserted. The statement was intended to establish a limit, yet Kennedy already possessed the argument regarding public funds situated on his side of that demarcation. His spouse believed it was relevant, Kennedy responded. "Dr. Beth Jordan Minette initiated divorce proceedings in August 2019, and within her sworn filing, she asserted that her husband had informed her he was terminating their marriage for you, Congresswoman." Omar's facial expression became rigid once more, but on this occasion it involved more than merely her jaw. Her entire visage appeared to retract inward momentarily, as if the space surrounding her had constricted. "That information does not constitute gossip. Rather, it is a statement provided under oath within a court of law." Kennedy executed a pause of sufficient duration to render the distinction obvious, given that gossip dissipates upon being challenged, whereas sworn declarations remain in legal files waiting to be examined. "I decline to provide commentary regarding the divorce proceedings of another individual," Omar stated. "I comprehend your position, ma'am, and I will not interrogate you regarding the personal aspect," Kennedy replied. "However, the financial component is part of the public record, and consequently, the financial component is my legitimate concern." That constituted the definitive and final transition away from the privacy-based defense and back towards the financial records. He proceeded to extract 3 pages from the stack and position them upon the table sequentially, maintaining the deliberate cadence of a man arranging plates for a challenging dinner engagement. He presented 1 page, then subsequent one, and then a third, each positioned intentionally, and each serving to diminish the perceived space in the room. Regarding the initial marriage, he began, "Ahmed Hirsi involved a religious ceremony devoid of legal documentation, which subsequently enabled you to legally wed another man without first divorcing the initial spouse. This resulted in a specific financial benefit, joint federal tax returns filed alongside a man to whom you were not legally wed, all while remaining legally married to a different individual." Omar's mouth became rigid, yet Kennedy persisted before she possessed the opportunity to transform the situation into another dissertation concerning complex issues. "That does not constitute a convoluted aspect of immigrant matrimony, Congresswoman. Rather, it is tax fraud within the state of Minnesota." He then made contact with the subsequent page. "Regarding the second marriage, Ahmed Elmeh, it involves an illicit union with an individual your own local newspaper cannot definitively verify is not your sibling. The resulting financial benefit concerned immigration status. Furthermore, whether that specific status was acquired through fraudulent means is, as of this morning, currently undergoing federal review." The phrase "currently undergoing federal review" resonated within the chamber with a particular coldness distinct from typical political language, as it failed to resemble mere commentary and instead sounded like a mechanism activating somewhere within the governmental structure. Omar refrained from interrupting, and this absence of interruption communicated something significant in its own right. Kennedy proceeded to touch the 3rd page. "Regarding the 3rd marriage, Tim Minette, it involves an illicit union with the proprietor of a consulting firm that your campaign had already compensated in the amount of $3 million. The monetary payments initiated while he remained married to another person. These disbursements persisted following your marriage to him, and furthermore, the payment amounts showed no decrease." He directed his gaze at her then, expressing not anger but rather the straightforward contempt characteristic of a man who believes the financial records have already articulated enough information. 3 distinct marriages, Congresswoman, 3 separate men, and every single one featuring a financial transaction woven through it comparable to a wire traversing a wall. And for the initial time that particular morning, the speech regarding identity that had initiated the proceeding seemed exceedingly distant. "That constitutes an outrageous," Omar initiated, and at this point her voice escalated, not in a commanding manner but rather with evident strain, typical of the sound produced by an individual ascending in pitch because the foundation beneath them has become unstable. As she escalated the statement, it appeared progressively less stable, given that anger can momentarily obscure uncertainty, yet only fleetingly, after which the immediate audience begins detecting the true cause underlying the display of anger. It represents an utterly outrageous characterization concerning 3 genuine relationships involving actual human beings and real emotions, and I will not allow this committee to diminish them. She was attempting to steer the proceeding back into the realm of human sentiment, into the ambiguous area where relationships could be characterized as complex, distressing, private, culturally multifaceted, and emotionally genuine, and consequently somehow beyond the scope of financial calculation. However, Kennedy had not constructed his specific argument based on sentiments, and emotional appeals were unable to obliterate the documented financial data. "Ma'am," Kennedy stated, and his vocal pitch did not escalate to match hers, primarily because doing so was unnecessary. Descriptive characterizations are devoid of specific dollar amounts. The statement resonated with the muted final impact of a hammer impacting wood, sufficiently straightforward to appear almost unsophisticated, yet incisive enough to divide the defense entirely in half. Official FEC filings, in point of fact, document $3 million transferring from your campaign funds to the specific company owned by the individual with whom you maintained a romantic relationship. He paused at that juncture, not for dramatic effect concerning the figure, but simply to permit the amount to remain precisely what it represented. That does not constitute a characterization, Congresswoman. Rather, it is a specific line item, and line items are devoid of emotions, possessing instead specific numbers. Omar initiated an opening of her mouth to offer a response, and for a fleeting moment, her body began assuming the habitual stance associated with a counteroffensive. Her jaw tightened, her shoulders became square, and her gaze ascended towards the committee members, as though the specific statement were finalized behind them and merely required articulation. However, the specific statement failed to materialize. Her mouth subsequently shut, her shoulders returned to their relaxed state, and the expression that rapidly crossed her visage was not one of capitulation, not yet, but rather the internal shock characteristic of someone reaching for a weapon and discovering the holster is void of contents. The immediate audience observed this for less than a solitary second, yet within the context of political conflict, less than a single second suffices when the camera is voracious and the argument is entirely devoid of further refuge. Kennedy proceeded to clasp his hands again, and 3 marriages, 3 trails of financial records, he remarked. Where I originate, Congresswoman, we would characterize that specific arrangement as a business model. The statement possessed inherent cruelty because it was devoid of exaggeration. It merely took the existing factual structure already presented and identified it, employing terminology so straightforward they seemed almost improper. Omar's facial expression became rigid, yet rigidity is fundamentally distinct from providing a response, and every individual present in the chamber grasped that point by this time. The presentation of a defensive stance remained accessible to her, yet the actual space available for providing an explanation had compressed to a narrow corridor no wider than the specific documents positioned directly before Kennedy. Subsequently, Kennedy reached beneath the file folder and retrieved a single final page of documentation. He grasped it utilizing both hands, and this marked the initial occasion throughout the entire morning that he had managed to document in such a manner. The entire room registered this shift before individuals comprehended the specific content, given that minor rituals carry significance within a hearing chamber, and an individual who has consistently handled paperwork with a single hand does not abruptly employ 2 unless the specific paper possesses considerable weight. The specific page was not slammed down, nor was it waved or brandished like a prop for television. Rather, it was elevated with care and almost quietly, and this meticulous handling intensified the situation because it implied not excitement, but definitive certainty. Mrs. Omar, Kennedy stated, and the transition from Congresswoman to Mrs. Omar appeared minor only to individuals not paying close attention. For 8 extensive years, you have consistently informed this country that absolutely no documentation exists linking you and Ahmed Elma as members belonging to the same biological family, asserting that no such document exists. The subsequent response lacked incisiveness, did not escalate in pitch, and was devoid of moral expansiveness, remaining merely flat. Omar's vocal tone was devoid of variation at that moment when she offered her response. That statement is accurate, she replied, her tone remaining uncharacteristically flat and devoid of typical rhetorical flourishes. That assessment is accurate, and furthermore, the overall flatness of her delivery carried its own inherent warning. It represented the distinct sound of an individual who has navigated through all prepared rhetorical options and has arrived at the single final available note. This committee has successfully acquired, Kennedy proceeded to explain, by utilizing a federal record subpoena, an official immigration application originally submitted in 1995 to the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service. Omar's hands subsequently positioned themselves flat upon the table surface, with her fingers splayed not frantically nor visibly shaking, but rather with the involuntary tensing typical of an individual whose body perceives impact before the conscious mind has fully acknowledged the impending realization. It is the official Form Y-130, Petition for Alien Relative, which was submitted on behalf of your specific family unit for the explicit purpose of family reunification. The specific official terminology effectively depleted the room of oxygen, principally because official language requires no shouting, Rather, it merely identifies, classifies, records relevant data, and subsequently waits. Kennedy proceeded to read the names, doing so at a dictation-like velocity, with each syllable distinctly separated from the next, and each name allocated its own distinct space, as though he were carefully arranging stones along a path that no individual could possibly bypass. He read the specific petitioner, the dependent, and various family members, and then, upon arriving at the two specific names of significance, he executed a pause. That deliberate cessation possessed greater impact than any vocal statement he had articulated throughout the entire morning. "Ilhan Omar," he articulated, subsequently raising his eyes to look over the rims of his eyeglasses. Moreover, for the initial time during that morning, her eyes engaged his directly and did not immediately avert their gaze. "And furthermore, Ahmed Noor say Elma," he persisted, and consequently positioned the specific page upon the table surface. The specific paper produced a minimal auditory contact sound against the wooden surface, a subtle noise that nonetheless resonated throughout the entire chamber simply because no other individual present was making any sound whatsoever. Regarding both individuals, it involves the identical application, the same explicit petition, the same specific household, and the identical family unit. He directed a subtle lean over the specific page, avoiding any dramatic effect, yet sufficient to demonstrate that this precise location represented the culmination where the fundamental argument had arrived following 8 extensive years of detours and deflections. The specific line explicitly documents the relationship to the petitioner concerning both names, and contained within the identical box, it states, "siblings." An individual located within the press row inadvertently dropped a writing pen, and consequently, no one present moved to retrieve it. The fluorescent lighting positioned above the dais continued to emit a distinct humming frequency that had been constant throughout the entire morning, yet now every individual present could perceive it clearly because all significant human noise had effectively been eliminated from the room. Omar refrained from speaking for a duration, and that specific moment inflicted greater damage than any yelled accusation possibly could have achieved. Throughout an extensive 8-year period, the nation had consistently received information asserting that the specific document was non-existent, that the question itself was malicious, that the overall investigation constituted a character smear, and furthermore that the allegation belonged merely to derogatory discourse. In contrast, at this moment, an official government form rested upon the table exhibiting the particular patience characteristic of an object that has never required active defense. "I have absolutely never observed that specific document," Omar stated, and furthermore her vocal register had noticeably shifted. It was lower in pitch and considerably faster. Moreover, it no longer represented the vocal tone of an individual delivering an ethical lecture, but rather the specific voice of someone responding to an inquiry she had not anticipated encountering in a public setting. I proceed to question its overall authenticity. Kennedy did not visibly react, observing that she was merely 12 years of age when the document was submitted by her father. "Ma'am," he spoke in a muted tone, and somehow the overall quietness rendered the statement distinctly colder. "It was legally subpoenaed directly from a federal records storage facility and subsequently authenticated by the INS. Furthermore, it explicitly states, in black ink on an official government form, that you and Ahmed Elmi are, in fact, brother and sister." That particular document, if it actually is authentic, that specific document does not, Omar initiated, yet the statement terminated abruptly before it possessed the capability to form a comprehensive defense. The specific words were articulated without definitive endings, each one progressing in an independent direction and ultimately impacting the identical invisible barrier in the manner a confined bird strikes the same window repeatedly because the perceived light appears as an escape route until actual impact demonstrates the contrary. Her hand subsequently elevated and performed a gesture distinctly smaller than all preceding ones, with fingers curling inward sequentially, effectively retreating from the surrounding atmosphere, as though the air itself would no longer support the significant weight of what she required to communicate. The specific circumstances regarding refugee resettlement are exceptionally complex, Moreover, family designations recorded on immigration forms originating from 3 decades ago do not necessarily reflect current reality. At that point, she ceased speaking. She stopped because the specific statement she was formulating possessed only two potential conclusions, and fundamentally, both of those options led directly into the identical metaphorical locked room. In the scenario that the form itself was incorrect, then the immediate question subsequently became precisely why her father had submitted a fraudulent federal immigration document under explicit penalty of perjury. Conversely, in the scenario that the form was indeed correct, then an extensive 8-year period of consistent public denial had just directly confronted the definitive black ink of the federal government itself. There existed no straightforward path situated between those two logical doors, no speech concerning identity sufficiently expansive to obscure both potential exits, and furthermore, no accusation possessed enough power to cause the physical paper itself to somehow dissolve. The immediate audience was capable of observing the precise moment when she perceived her own internal logic nearing its definitive conclusion and consequently comprehended that completing the specific statement would actually be worse than simply abandoning it altogether. "Ma'am," Kennedy stated, and at this moment his vocal tone was extremely quiet. Moreover, that specific quietness did not imply gentleness, but rather was distinctly mechanical, characteristic of the muted operation of a machine completing the exact function it was constructed to perform. "Are you saying the document is wrong, that you and Elm are not siblings?" Omar proceeded to draw in a breath, stating, "I am explicitly stating that the overall circumstances are, because in the event that you are asserting the document is incorrect," Kennedy proceeded, maintaining a consistent calm and flat tone, "you are consequently stating that your father falsified information on an official federal immigration form submitted under explicit penalty of perjury, and that, Congresswoman, constitutes a federal crime." The specific term, crime, resonated within the air comparable to a heavy stone descending into a deep well, significant, straightforward, and no longer subject to modification. Omar's mouth subsequently opened, and the initial form of a word barely developed, representing a minimal amount of actual sound, and it potentially could have been various responses, including the familiar term she had employed countless times previously, the word initiating with I and concluding with phobia, the specific term that had historically closed all avenues of inquiry, halted questions, intimidated editors, disciplined critics, and furthermore transformed every legitimate request for documentation into an evaluation concerning the ethical character of the individual making the request. At that moment, her mouth subsequently closed. The specific word remained unspoken because the official document was positioned upon the table. This included official Form 130 in black ink on government letterhead, featuring both her name and Elmy's name contained within the same family unit, all within a form submitted by her own father. She comprehended, possessing the particular clarity of an individual who has successfully navigated politics by selecting precisely the correct term at the exact appropriate moment, that this specific word would not prove effective in this instance. Characterizing the form itself as Islamophobic would not cause the two documented names to somehow disappear, nor would it alter the checked box, nor obliterate the relationship line, nor render the specific paper less federal in nature or less enduring. Forms are essentially patient entities. They do not engage in arguments on television, nor explain themselves on cable news panels, do not experience offense, do not trend on social media, nor do they panic when attacked. Rather, they remain situated in filing cabinets for decades, accumulating dust beneath fluorescent lighting, indifferent to every specific speech articulated above them. Furthermore, they do not care what precise labels politicians apply to the individuals inquiring about them, and consequently, when someone ultimately opens the drawer, they are still present. Her left hand subsequently elevated from the table surface unhurriedly, in the manner that her arm were navigating through a substance distinctly denser than air. Two specific fingers arrived to rest against her lower lip, neither obscuring her mouth nor concealing her face, but simply pressing gently against the skin, and this action functioned to restrain something situated behind her teeth that was forbidden from being introduced into the chamber. This action did not constitute the gesture of a victor, nor was it the specific gesture of a woman triumphantly enduring persecution. Rather, it represented the gesture of an individual whose personal vocabulary had reached its absolute outermost limit and subsequently discovered an official government document waiting at that very juncture. The particular woman situated in the gallery who had previously nodded during Omar's initial statement was no longer directing her gaze at Omar. This represented the most severe alteration within the room, principally because it was muted and consequently carried distinct honesty. She was intently focused on the official documentation, specifically the I-130, observing the two names recorded on the same specific line, and contemplating the paper that had achieved what no explicit argument had been permitted to accomplish for an extensive 8-year period. The specific movement concerning her gaze from the politician to the record itself constituted a definitive verdict that no presiding chairman required to formally announce. Reliance upon the verbal rhetoric had effectively been substituted with direct scrutiny regarding the displayed exhibit. "I possess absolutely nothing further to articulate at this specific time," Omar stated, offering a precise 9-word response. Moreover, it contained neither disgust, nor mentions of bigotry, nor moral fervor, nor a lecture concerning refugees, nor a broad indictment regarding the individuals situated opposite her, but simply the stark, minimal statement legal counsel advises clients to utter when persistence would merely result in additional damage. This represented the sound regarding a politician transforming into a different entity on live television, occurring not because Kennedy had escalated his vocal volume, but rather because the chamber had ultimately heard a response that constituted neither a deflection nor a counteraccusation nor a lecture, and furthermore, not a specific word terminating in phobia. It was fundamentally a single government form featuring two distinct names contained on the identical line. Kennedy proceeded to stand up. Furthermore, he did not abruptly jump to his feet, nor did he perform any display of victory, nor direct his gaze around to ensure that the cameras were capturing him favorably for doing so. He directed an assent typical of the manner a man stands following the completion regarding an assignment that was distasteful yet essential, unhurried to a degree that no aspect concerning the movement implied celebration. Subsequently, he proceeded to walk the full extent regarding the table in a measured and subdued manner, resembling the way an individual traverses a property boundary he has been familiar with for his entire life, mentally counting specific fence posts utilizing his fingers, each post constituting a distinct boundary and each boundary representing a specific fact. Regarding the year 2002, he stated, explicitly making contact with the initial page, it involved a religious ceremony devoid regarding legal documentation, which subsequently enabled you to legally wed another man without first divorcing the initial spouse. Making contact again. Concerning the year 2009, it involved a legal marriage to Ahmed Elmeh, all while remaining involved within a religious marriage to the initial man. Making further contact. Regarding 2014 and 2015, joint federal tax returns were filed alongside the initial man, all while remaining legally married to the second individual. Making subsequent contact. Concerning 2017, it involved the finalization regarding a divorce from Elm, occurring 8 extensive years following the wedding, and 2 years after the specific tax fraud was discovered. Making continued contact. Regarding the year 2018, it involved a legal marriage contracted to Hersey, ultimately. Making final contact. Concerning the year 2019, it involved a subsequent divorce from Hersey, principally because there existed a third distinct individual at that particular time. Making concluding contact. Regarding the year 2020, it involved a legal marriage to Tim Minette occurring after over $3 million in specific campaign funds had already been dispersed to his company. Making one last contact, he subsequently arrived at the final page and repositioned his finger upon it for a duration distinctly longer than he had utilized for the preceding ones. This pause was sufficient time for the cameras to observe the specific gesture, and furthermore sufficient time for a male observer in the gallery to lean forward in an attempt to discern what information the paper articulated. Concerning the year 1995, Kennedy stated, explicitly referencing official federal documentation, It involves your name and Elmi's name contained on the identical line within the same specific family, documenting them as siblings. He directs his body back to face her across the extensive table surface, across the distinct white array concerning documentation extending from his specific side to hers, comparable to a path leading towards a location that neither of them could continue feigning did not actually exist. 8 specific dates, 3 distinct husbands, and 3 trails consisting of financial records. His vocal tone persisted as calm, and somehow that overall quality rendered the specific summary significantly more severe. Furthermore, absolutely none regarding these specific relationships, not a solitary one, Mrs. Omar, exists without an explicit financial transaction being connected directly to it. These transactions include the acquisition regarding immigration benefits, the commission concerning tax fraud, and over $3 million within campaign funds transferring directly to the company belonging to the man with whom you were intimately involved. The specific statement was inherently severe because the underlying structure supporting it was severe, and fundamentally, Kennedy did not concern himself with rendering it polite. He subsequently removed his eyeglasses and proceeded to fold them with the precise, deliberate care regarding an individual shutting a book he has concluded reading, and position them next to the I-130 documentation. Consequently, the minimal click concerning the hinges resonated within the overall quietness comparable to a latch engaging securely into place. You consistently characterized it as Islamophobia, Mrs. Omar. Throughout an 8-year period, every single inquiry was deemed Islamophobia. Every reporter who posed a question was labeled a bigot. And furthermore, every specific investigation was designated a politically motivated witch hunt. He proceeded to make physical contact with the documentation a solitary final occasion. Moreover, for an extensive 8 years, this specific paper was situated within a filing cabinet contained in a federal records storage facility, resting in a metal drawer and accumulating dust in the darkness. He subsequently returned to his seat, clasped his hands unhurriedly, and proceeded to articulate 2 precise words in a tone softer than all preceding statements. Somebody asked. The specific video clip subsequently achieved over 55 million views within a mere 72-hour period, occurring not because individuals had never previously observed a politician becoming trapped, nor because Washington abruptly discovered that congressional hearings were capable of generating significant moments. The specific video propagated in the manner it did because the content contained something distinctly rarer than visible outrage, rarer than personal insults, and further rarer than another angry partisan confrontation designed precisely to provide both ideological sides with exactly the information they already desired. It encapsulated a profound silence that failed to convey a sense of calculated strategy. It specifically contained the precise instant when an articulated statement effectively failed, occurring when a particular term that had proven successful for years ultimately reached the absolute limit of its utility, and consequently terminated entirely when confronted with a physical government document. And furthermore, within a specific political culture fundamentally dependent upon constant auditory commotion, that particular variety of profound silence propagates distinctly faster than any yelled scream possibly could. Individuals universally referred to it as the documents clip, primarily because that precise object was what the entire moment ultimately simplified itself to after all the elaborate speeches had effectively dissipated. The condensed variation lasted a precise 40 seconds, depicting Kennedy reading directly from the official I-130 document, explicitly referencing the identical application, the same specific family unit, and documenting siblings, followed by Omar's fingers subsequently ascending to her lower lip, and finally the specific 9-word statement that immediately followed. It was subsequently edited, reposted repeatedly, significantly slowed down given captions, framed, and consequently distributed through every digital platform that inherently relies upon public humiliation. Nevertheless, even when entirely fragmented and reduced to mere sound bites, the specific video clip did not relinquish its essential meaning. The specific silence contained within the footage did not represent the